turning point. One small change, and everything moves differently. Today, the story of a product so small it almost does not look like an invention. It is only a thin strip with gauze in the center and adhesive around it. A few seconds, and the cut is covered. We are so used to this moment that we barely see the idea inside it. Someone cuts a finger in the kitchen, opens a drawer, takes out a Band-Aid, covers the wound, and goes back to life. There is no drama in that moment, and nothing looks like a business idea at work. But that is exactly what makes Band-Aid powerful. Because before it existed, a small injury was not always a small task. The cut could be tiny, the pain could pass quickly, and the whole problem could look almost too small to matter. But the process around that injury was much bigger than the injury itself. You did not just close a wound. You had to stop what you were doing, look for the right materials, prepare a dressing, hold it in place, and somehow keep it there. And often, you had to do all of that at the worst possible moment, after you were already hurt. That is where the real story begins. This is not really a story about inventing bandages or creating a complicated medical breakthrough. It is the story of a tiny product that removed a surprising amount of hidden work from ordinary life. Because sometimes a great product does not add complexity. Sometimes it simply removes all the little steps nobody wanted to do in the first place. The strange thing about products like Band-Aid is that they look obvious after they exist. Today, the idea feels almost too simple. Of course, the gauze should already be attached to the adhesive strip. Of course, it should be ready inside a box. Of course, a person should be able to take it out, peel it open, and use it immediately. But before Band-Aid, that kind of simplicity was not the normal experience. People had materials. They had gauze, bandages, adhesive tape, scissors, and medicine cabinets. But materials are not the same thing as a solution. When a person cuts a finger, they do not want to become a nurse to themselves. In that moment, nobody wants to build a tiny first aid system out of loose materials. A person is simply trying to stop a small problem from taking over the room, especially when it happens at home, in the middle of cooking, cleaning, washing, holding things, moving too fast, and trying to get back to the ordinary rhythm of the day. That is what made the problem interesting. The wound itself was small, but the work around it felt too big for the moment. It was not dangerous or dramatic. It was just irritatingly inconvenient. And those are the kinds of problems people often tolerate for years. They become normal because they are not big enough to start a revolution, but they repeat in ordinary places, around ordinary objects, wherever people use knives, tools, hot pans, sharp edges, and their own hands. That is why Band-Aid is not just interesting as a medical product. It is interesting as a business product. Because a good business does not always begin with a giant pain. Sometimes, it begins with a small irritation that millions of people keep accepting, because nobody has made it disappear yet. The story of Band-Aid does not begin with a big meeting. There was no market study, no category strategy, and no grand attempt to design the future of first aid. It begins at home, in an ordinary kitchen. Earle Dickson worked for Johnson & Johnson. His wife, Josephine, often got small cuts and burns while cooking. Nothing catastrophic, just the kind of small domestic injuries that happen when hands are always doing something. A knife slips while cooking. A hot pan touches the skin for half a second. A finger catches the sharp edge of an ordinary object. The injury itself is not the whole story. The real problem begins after it happens, because then the person has to interrupt the day, prepare a dressing from loose materials, keep it in place, and somehow continue as if this tiny accident did not just take over the kitchen, The problem was not that people did not know how to cover a wound. They did. The problem was that the solution had to be assembled every time, as if every small cut required a person to create a miniature medical station in the middle of ordinary life. And Dickson saw something important there. He was not staring at a blank page, trying to invent medicine from zero. He was watching a familiar problem and noticing the part everyone else had accepted. Too much work stood between the injury and the help. That changes the meaning of the whole story. Band-Aid was not born from the question, how do we create a new medical technology? It was born from a much more human question. Why does a small wound require so much trouble? Once you see that, the value is no longer hidden in the gauze or the tape. It is hidden in the fact that a person should not have to combine those things by themselves at the moment when they least want to do it. So Dickson did something that can look almost too small from the outside. He took a familiar strip of adhesive tape, placed a small piece of gauze where the wound would touch it, and prepared the dressing before anyone needed it. That was the whole move. No complicated machine, no dramatic laboratory moment, and nothing that looked like the future when you placed it on a table. Just two ordinary materials, arranged around one quiet idea. Help should be ready before the injury happens. And that was the turning point. Not because Dickson created a new kind of medicine, but because he changed when the work was done. Before Band-Aid, the work started after the cut. At the moment of pain, hurry, and awkward movement, when one hand might already be busy holding the wound. Dickson moved that work somewhere else. He put it into the product. He did it before the cut, before the frustration, before that little domestic scene where a person has to search for gauze, tape, and scissors while trying not to make the situation worse. That is why Band-Aid was more than a bandage. It was first aid prepared before it was needed. From the outside, he added almost nothing. But inside the human experience, he removed a lot. The old scene changed. Instead of someone fighting with loose materials while the day was already interrupted, the annoying little struggle had been absorbed into the strip itself. It takes longer to explain the work Band-Aid removed than to use a Band-Aid itself. And that is the point. The idea looked simple because the difficulty had been removed, not because the idea was weak. A small injury no longer needed a small operation around it. It could finally have a small solution. But at first, this did not look like a huge business. It looked like a household fix. A husband saw that his wife kept facing the same small problem, and he prepared a better way for her to handle it. There was no feeling of an empire, no familiar box on millions of shelves, no sense that this little dressing would become part of ordinary family life. There was only an attempt to remove unnecessary friction from one repeated moment. And that is what makes Band-Aid so interesting. Many products look too small in the beginning because the problem they solve is also small. They do not announce themselves as revolutions, and at first, they may not look impressive at all. They simply make one annoying moment easier. But if that annoying moment happens to millions of people, the convenience stops being small. Kitchen cuts do not belong to one house. Scraped knees do not belong to one family. People burn, scratch, nick, and bump themselves because they are living ordinary life. That is what made Dickson's idea stronger than it first appeared. He was not solving a rare problem. He was solving a small problem that was everywhere. In business, that can be more powerful than a big problem that happens only sometimes. A rare pain can be intense, but daily irritation repeats. And every time it repeats, the same question appears in the background. Why does this tiny thing require so much effort? Band-Aid answered that question without giving people an explanation. It answered with a ready form, something that could be placed in a box, sold in a store, kept near ordinary life, and used by almost anyone without training. That is when a private household fix begins to become a product. While Dickson made dressings for Josephine, it was personal. But once that same idea could travel beyond one kitchen, once it could wait in other homes before the next small injury happened, it became something bigger. It became a new expectation. A small injury could now have a small answer, not because the wound changed, because the path from wound to help became shorter. But even a strong product does not automatically become a habit. At first, Band-Aid did not sell like a future household icon, and that makes sense. On a store shelf, it could look almost too simple. A ready-made dressing made from familiar materials, something many customers might believe they could make themselves. For the kind of buyer who counts every coin, the question was obvious. Why pay for this when I already have gauze and tape at home? Why buy something I might not even need today? That was the sales problem. Band-Aid was useful, but its usefulness was not fully visible until the exact moment a small accident happened. So Johnson & Johnson made a move that can look strange if you only count the cost of each piece. They gave some away. Not because the product had no value, but because the first experience was worth more than the first sale. Because this was not a product people understood by staring at the box. It was a product people understood when life suddenly gave them a reason to use it. That is why putting Band-Aids into the hands of Boy Scout troops made so much sense. Scouts were exactly the kind of people who might scrape a knee, cut a finger, get a small injury outdoors, and need quick help before the day could continue. In that moment, the free sample stopped being a free sample. It became proof. Band-Aid was no longer a little dressing someone could ignore on a shelf. It became speed, relief, and the thing that turned a small emergency back into a small problem. And once people experienced that, the product did not need a long explanation. They understood the real value, not the material in the box, but the work they no longer had to do. That is the real business lesson in those early sales. Giving it away was not simply losing a few bandages, it was buying the customer's first experience with the product. And for Band-Aid, that first experience mattered more than any explanation. Because this was not something people hoped to use every day. It was something they wanted to have before the day went wrong. You hope you never need it, but if you do, you want it to be there. That is how a tiny dressing begins to become a household essential. Not because people admire it every morning, but because every family understands the quiet comfort of knowing quick help is nearby. Over time, Band-Aid moved from maybe useful to this should be at home. And that is a powerful place for any product. When people do not buy it for excitement, they buy it for readiness. Band-Aid became big, not because small injuries became dramatic. It became big because small injuries were everywhere. A person is cooking dinner, a child is running outside, someone is fixing something at home, and suddenly the day is interrupted by a tiny wound that does not need a hospital, but still needs an answer. That is what Band-Aid gave people. It did not make everyday life feel more medical. It made the small interruptions feel easier to handle, less friction, more readiness, a little more control in the exact moment when ordinary life suddenly becomes inconvenient. And maybe that is why the product became so familiar. People do not usually stop and admire a Band-Aid. They use it and move on. But that is the quiet power of the product. It disappears into the routine because it removed the part of the routine nobody wanted. That is what made Band-Aid more than a strip of tape. It was a small object that changed the scale of a small problem. Before it, a minor injury could create a surprisingly large amount of work. After it, the response finally matched the wound. It was small, ready, and immediate. And sometimes that is all a great product has to do. Remove the unnecessary work so completely that people forget it was ever there. That was Band-Aid's turning point, a tiny product that made first aid ready before life had time to interrupt.